So, what we are going to do today is, I'll make sure I'm on track here with what we said we would do today. Yes, we are going to talk to you in a continuing vein of what we've been talking about, and that is disciple-making culture. Disciple-making culture. You know, disciple-making, discipleship, being a disciple, these are all things that are near and dear to the heart of Jesus, right? He's the one who gave the Great Commission about disciple-making to his disciples, to make disciples of all nations, right? So if we're talking about disciple-making, we're on the right track. And our heart and goal in this little series is that we would create a culture where disciple-making disciples emerge. When people get involved with what we're doing, that they would grow as disciples and they themselves would be able to make disciples. So, what we're going to do today is Cameron and I are going to follow up on last week's message, which was, what is a disciple maker? And this week we want to do some frequently asked questions about disciple makers. So, at the end of this, if there's time, we'll give you a chance. If you have another question, we'll do our best to answer it. And but we've started with 6 questions that we think are pretty good ones that will help you understand our perspective on being a disciple maker. Now, if you want to catch up on anything that you've missed, you can go to the website, go onto the app, podcast, YouTube, Facebook, and catch up on the past messages that you missed. So, that said, Cameron, is there anything you want to say to intro?
Not really. I think that was a good intro. Yeah, I think we're ready. I'll ask the first question. So, like Wade was saying, we've been talking about discipleship. Last week, he was talking something about being a disciple maker. So the first question is, how do I know when I'm ready to be a disciple maker? You know, how do you know when it's time? How do you know when you're ready? Can you share some of that?
How do I know when I'm ready to be a disciple maker? Okay, or put yourself in that question. Well, first of all, I want to go back to our definition of disciple maker that we used last week just to bring a consistent thread throughout everything we're going to say. And that is, we said a disciple maker is someone who takes responsibility to help others grow as disciples of Jesus, right? Someone who takes responsibility to help others grow as disciples of Jesus. So I think when we think about readiness, so often, should I be a disciple maker? Can I be a disciple maker? We go to ability, right? Am I able? Do I have what it takes? And then the problem with that is that if you go to ability, real quickly you learn that you never feel like you're good enough, right? Because there's always more you can learn. There's always more you can know. You can always grow, and that's a good thing. But if you wait until you think you're ready, that time may never come. And a lot of lives might not be changed. And you might not grow as much because you're not kind of figuring it out as you go. That's part of how Jesus helps us. So here's what I want to say it is about. I don't think it's as much about ability as it is about desire and faith. Okay, so, desire. Do you want to be a part of this Great Commission? Right? That's a great question to ask yourself. What's your desire? And then, so you're a part of the equation, do you want to do this? Right? And then, God's a part of the equation, right? Do you sense God giving you an assignment to help these people be disciples, right? So, and faith. Do you believe God has given you an assignment to help this person or these people grow as disciples? That's pretty important. Maybe more important than your ability is God assigning you something? Because maybe he thinks, you're able. And then lastly, the person or people that you want to disciple. Do they want your help to grow as a disciple of Jesus? Right? So I think it's a lot about desire. Do you want to do it? Do you believe God is wanting you to do it? Like has an assignment for this person or these people? And does that person or those people say, yes, I want to grow as a disciple, and I want you to help me. So I think if you go by those questions, it just makes it so simple. It boils it down, right? Do you believe God wants you to do this? Do they want your help? And if you just go with that, I think it'll cut through a lot of the obstacles of ability that you'll just never feel ready. Does that make sense? So shifting the target a little bit to hearing God and taking a risk and asking someone as opposed to just feeling like you have enough tools. Okay. And by the way, I think that works in any discipleship context. Those are the questions you need to answer. It's not just one-on-one discipleship. It's a microchurch leader. It's a hub leader. It's a whatever context you can think of. Those are important questions. Okay? All right. Are you ready for your first question, Cameron? All right. For 5 cents, I'm giving you the question, does someone need to be more mature or older to disciple someone else? In other words, does someone need to be more mature or older than that person or those people to disciple them?
Thanks for asking, Wade. Yes, does someone need to be more mature or older? I will say that depends largely on your strategy. Meaning, do you have to be more mature or older? Well, if your strategy leans on your maturity and your experience, then yes, that's very important. If you have a strategy that utilizes that, then it's very important. We'll talk strategies at a later point. But on the other hand, are you using a strategy that uses a tool or something to empower you that has with it maturity and wisdom and direction into it? If you're using something like that, then maturity doesn't seem to be the most important question at that point. If you're partnering with a tool, if something's helping you and it doesn't lean on your own maturity or experience. You see, the problem a lot of times I think with the maturity question is it doesn't take tools into account, tools that empower you, that have those things kind of built into them, regardless of who uses them. They carry their own wisdom, they carry their own direction. And if you think about it, what's a tool anyway, other than something that helps you accomplish something beyond your own ability, right? I can use a wrench, and I can get a nut or a bolt way tighter than I can with my own hands. That's why I use a wrench, because my ability can only do so much. The tool allows me to do much more than I could do on my own. And another cool thing about tools is it can a lot of times can take something that may seem really complex and make it really usable and simple. So I don't know very much about the internet or how it works or how any of that goes. But if I have a good tool, if I have a computer, if I have a web browser, I can get on and check my email, and there's something probably just mind-bendingly complex about that whole process of how that computer works, of how it connects to my email, which isn't even in a location. It's somewhere like on the internet. So it's like it takes this really complicated thing and makes it really easy for me to use because I know how to use the tools to accomplish the things I'm trying to accomplish. So I think tools, the presence of tools makes the maturity question not the most important question necessarily, right? And if you're thinking, if you think with me about if you're leading a microchurch, it's easy to think one-on-one discipleship because it's you and the other person. But say I'm leading a microchurch and I believe I have to be more mature than everybody. One, I have to gather a room of people who are less mature than me to come. And then, oh no, we invited somebody and they're older and more mature in the Lord than I am. And now it's like, take my Bible, teach us. Like you're in charge now because you're wiser, you're older. So if we think of it that way, it has to lean on responsibility, on agreement, on assignment. What's the Lord asking you to do, and are you doing that? So a lot of times, your own maturity, your own experience will help you determine what tools you need to use. If you don't feel like you're very mature, then you're going to need to lean on a tool and a strategy that doesn't depend on that. If you do have a lot of experience with the Lord, then you've got some options of different ways that you can approach discipleship. So the better question seems to be, do I have the characteristics of a disciple maker? Not am I mature enough? And Wade talked about those being faithful. Am I faithful? Am I equipped? Have I prioritized disciple making? And then can I contribute the things that disciple makers contribute, such as guidance, which, as I mentioned, could be baked into a tool. There could be a tool that helps offer guidance, and I help apply that. Accountability and prayer. And if you pay attention to those two lists of three, none of them have to do with maturity. You could be just come to faith and have an assignment from the Lord to make disciples, and you could already have all of those things in your wheelhouse to work with. You don't have to rely on a strategy. It's not there. There isn't a strategy that exists like that, but you don't have to rely on one that says I have to be miles ahead of everybody else to be helpful. And I think that should be a relief to a lot of us in this room as we're thinking about it and going to the Lord and asking, "Do you have an assignment for me in disciple making?" No, keep it. Wade, I have a question for you.
Let me say something real quick about Cameron's. And two, I just want to add what Cameron said. It's like, remember, making disciples of Jesus, not of you, right, as a disciple maker. And that put everything Cameron says, that just clicks into place when you remember that, okay? It's not about how amazing you are. It's about how amazing he is and your willingness to help someone else walk in his amazingness.
All right, next question. Wade, so there's some kind of a relationship of disciple maker and people who's being discipled. But how important is it that we define the relationship of disciple maker to disciple? You know, how important is that definition piece to that?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't see it coming. Just kidding. People ask that all the time, right? And I think that often people wrestle with that, and there's a hesitation to define that, and somehow that seems more spiritual or, you know, whatever. I've been in that place before where you hesitate to define, you know, your relationship between a disciple maker and someone you're discipling or people you're discipling. But I want to go back real quick to our discipleship definition, which is intentional participation in the formative process of a disciple. Right? That's by the disciple and by others. Intentional participation in the formative process of a disciple. So I just want to lean on that intentional participation, right? I think it's hard to intentionally participate if there's not clarity, right? It's hard to intentionally participate if you don't know what role you're supposed to be playing in participating, right? So I think it's more important than we might think to define a disciple maker to disciple relationship so that everyone involved can play their role well. Because clarity, it brings clarity. Clarity is helpful. Clarity is a powerful thing. You know, clarity of roles and goals, right? Clarity so that each person can embrace a posture of what they're trying to get out of that relationship. If the relationship's ambiguous or you're not sure the nature of it, it's harder to take the posture that's going to help you play the role that you're wanting to be playing in that relationship. Okay? You know, and I think the question too is I would challenge someone who would say, well, you know, you really don't have to ever, you know, define it, or people don't have to know. I would say, why wouldn't you want to be clear? Right? And the answer to that, probably most people's answers, if you hold it up to the plumb line, and test it, it's probably coming out of insecurity. It's probably coming out of a sense of inadequacy or feeling ill-equipped or not wanting to take responsibility. Right? So I think that insecurity is the enemy of clarity when it comes to a discipleship relationship. And if that's true, then we're making clarity the enemy. No, we don't want to define it. When really, insecurity, not clarity, is the enemy of effective disciple making. You know, there's fears in there. When I say insecurity, there's pride. Pride's kind of a form of insecurity, right? Fears flow out of insecurity. You know, you don't want to yield to someone else's help. You feel like it creates a pecking order. You feel like it's, you know, this you know, who's the most spiritual, or who has the most spiritual authority, and like you're afraid to define all those things. But I just want to encourage you, get secure, and if you want to disciple someone, be clear that you want to do that. If you want discipled by someone, be clear that you want to do that, okay? It will help, and it will give you traction towards transformation. Okay, clarity is powerful for traction toward transformation. And just an example, imagine if, so I'm the hub leader here, kind of like lead pastor, right? Cameron's the associate hub leader. It's like, imagine if we were afraid to embrace our roles, right? It would be really hard for not just us to lead well, but hard for you guys because of our insecurity. Or a microchurch leader. Imagine a microchurch leader like being not wanting to call themselves a disciple maker, but that's part of being a microchurch leader. You're creating a context where disciple-making disciples emerge, and it was going to be real hard for the people coming to that microchurch and the leaders in that relationship if they're not clear about what their roles are, so they can take a posture to help with those roles. Does that make sense? Okay, clarity, good.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways this understanding helps is, I've encountered this time and time again. I've had this perspective at different times, and it's like, of course I'm a disciple maker. Like, there's all these people that I'm always investing in, and whenever I see this person, like, I pray for them, or I maybe shared a Bible verse, and of course I'm a disciple maker. I'm discipling these people, but they don't really know that. Like, they wouldn't define that. Like, if you ask them if I was discipling them, they'd be like, no, like, that's just him being him. Like, he's just doing those things. So there's an importance a lot of times for, we can feel like we're being a disciple maker without that clarity, without some of the defining relationship stuff. And it feels like we're doing it, but it's kind of being held back from its potential.
Yeah. So if you can remove all the stigmas, all the fears, the pride, the spiritual pecking order, whatever, all the stuff that you're trying to avoid, just push that aside and say, oh, clarity for clarity's sake is actually helpful here. Then I think you're going to find a lot more impact in disciple making. Okay? All right, Cameron, I got a question for you. Is there only one right approach or strategy to making disciples?
This one's easy to answer because my previous answer really relied on there being multiple strategies. So I'll say no, of course not. And when we're considering different strategies in disciple making, it's really important to know how to evaluate different strategies, to know which ones are good, which ones are bad, because not all strategies will count as discipleship, the way we've been defining it. So I think we have to ask of each approach, which is really helpful. Some of the things that Wade's been teaching about with discipleship gives us some good tools for assessment. We get to ask each approach to discipleship, is this helping people to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to help others do the same, to love him? And does this strategy use the formative elements of the Word, of the Spirit, of faith and action? And if you're using a discipleship strategy where any of those are missing, you should be immediately suspect of that strategy and the kind of fruit that may be produced through it, because those are all very important, I would say critical in discipleship and disciple making. So when you're looking at different strategies, it's good to know, have some kind of rubric stuff like, oh, is this a good strategy? Is this a bad strategy? So like I was saying, there's no one right approach. It depends on a lot of different things, but there's two really common kind of styles of approach that have a lot of kind of you could subdivide those into different strategies within those. But they're both really legitimate approaches to discipleship, and I'll refer to them as like as a follow me type approach, and then a coaching type approach to disciple making. So if you take a follow me approach, it requires you to have, like I was talking last time, a bit more maturity. You need to be a little further down the road than the person that you're helping, and you're saying, hey, listen, I'm a little further ahead than you. Like, let me help you out. Like, I remember these kinds of things. Like, I've learned a lot. I've had a lot of experience. Like, I can help you avoid a lot of things that I learned the hard way. Just let me help you. So if you look at the Bible, you think of Paul in 1 Corinthians where he says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So he's saying, in the ways that I'm following Christ, follow me in those ways, and I'll help you out. And, if I like thinking in terms of, I think a sports analogy really helps us with this. This is, okay, I've been on the team for a while, like I've been playing this sport, I've got this this rookie here, like, I'm going to take you under my wing to show you the things that I've learned. I'm going to kind of teach you things about our team. I'm going to help you out with some of the nuances of the game and how we play here, and hoping that person even becomes better than I am. But it's like, oh, getting started can be kind of rough, or being at this point, like, I've been through that phase. Like, let me help you out. That's kind of, in my mind, like, that's a good way to equate that, a good analogy for it. Another strategy, since there isn't just one right approach, I think that's a very common approach, is a coaching type role, where instead of kind of being out ahead, you're coming alongside someone, and you're probably asking them really good questions. You probably have some really helpful tools. And with that strategy, maturity isn't as much of a big deal, right? Because you're not saying, follow me. You're saying, hey, what do you need? What are the next steps for you? What's God asking you to do? And if we go back to a sports analogy, this is like having a good coach, right? Your coach doesn't have to be better than you at playing the sport, because a lot of times they're not the best person at the sport, or else we would have very few coaches. And a lot of times people who are really good at the sport aren't even very good coaches. So it is understanding fundamentals, understanding how to help people, how to come alongside, how to encourage them to work as a team, how to hold people accountable, how to offer guidance. You know what drills work, you know what practices work, you know how to help somebody kind of take the next steps. Those are hallmarks of a good coach. So that's a totally different strategy than saying, hey, follow me in all these different ways. It's, hey, I'm going to help you follow Jesus, and I'm here, I'm in your corner, and I'm helping you do that the best I can. So those open up a whole range of different strategies for how to make disciples and how to do that well. Does that make sense? So it doesn't just have to look one way. It can look a variety of ways, as long as it checks a lot of those boxes for what makes good discipleship.
I'll just say something about that. For me personally, I used to think it was just the, follow me as I follow Christ sort of perspective. And it's funny, the more I've grown with the Lord, and the longer I've walked with Him, I've shifted more to, how can I come alongside you? How can I help you? What's God doing in your life, instead of come and do what God's doing in my life? And I think there's something that's really freeing in that. I think there's a burden that you don't carry in that, because it's on Christ, and you're just journeying with people. You're sharing a journey with that person, but it's not just, hey, come join my journey. I think there's totally place for that when God calls people to that. But I think also it's really nice to just join their journey and help them on their journey, and to just enjoy that process. So, I love what Cameron was saying.
All right. Next question, Wade. Does a person have to be a church leader to be a disciple maker? Do they have to be a church leader to be a disciple maker?
Of course, that's why you pay Cameron, right? So he can make all the disciples. Yeah, woo! I'm taking a vacation. Cameron's got this. You hear that in churches, like, well, that's what we pay the pastor for. And it's like, but when you read the Bible, what you find is God gives roles to the body of Christ. He gives these gifts of Christ, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. He gives them to help the body grow into its maturity, that they're to equip the body. They're equippers. They're not just, I'll do it all for you, right? And so, no, you do not have to wait until you're a church leader to make disciples. You don't have to wait until you're a church leader to take responsibility for the Great Commission. If you're following Jesus, you have the invitation, the commission. You can choose to participate in that because you want to, because you believe He's invited you into that, okay? That desire and faith, like we talked about. So what I do want to say, though, is church leaders, they do have a role and they do have a responsibility that God has called them into, right? And, to make disciples, you don't need that specific role or that specific responsibility that a church leader has. I think the value of church leaders in our context here is that church leaders actually are trying to not take away your responsibility to make disciples because they want to do it. Church leaders here are trying to help you become a disciple-making disciple, right? Church leaders, micro-church leaders, hub leaders. I think even the children's ministry back there, right? They're trying to help the kids grow up, and so they can participate as they grow in the Lord. So yeah, don't wait until you're a church leader, and don't think you don't have responsibility for disciple making unless you're a church leader, okay? And I just want to encourage you, like, if you're like, I want to be a part of what God is doing, I want to be a part of disciple making, then I would encourage you to pray about who could help show you how to do that. Okay? Come alongside somebody, share a journey together, and get some tools, get equipped, prove your faithfulness, like, start there. And then, as God gives you assignments, step out and take risks, say yes to those assignments, and have a kingdom impact making disciples. Okay, Cameron, ready for your last question? Okay, what is and isn't the responsibility of a disciple maker?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, because this question could go wrong in a variety of ways, very easily. You can take that kind of guidance piece and use it to pick up too much responsibility for somebody else's life. And the tricky part is sometimes people will give you more responsibility for their life than you should have, because having responsibility for yourself is really hard sometimes. So it's easy if somebody wants to take that and be like, yes, tell me what to do. Like, I'll do it. And so there's a fine line there to navigate. But your main responsibility as a disciple maker, like we were talking about and I mentioned earlier, is those three contributions, right? Guidance, accountability, and prayer. If you pick up much more than those three kind of pieces, then you're kind of in a danger zone for assuming too much responsibility on other people's lives, right? You need to love the people and to make those contributions the best that you can. A couple of the things that isn't your responsibility as a disciple maker, there's a whole bunch of things, but one of them is you're not responsible to give really good advice, right? And that should be a relief to some people and be really challenging to the people here who love giving advice. And I know you're probably in here. There's people who love to give advice when they're not asked. They love to give advice when they are asked, and it'll be really hard to hold that back. And I feel like in that situation, perhaps if somebody's asking you for advice, I feel like you should be free to give it, but you should still be very cautious, because then you run the risk of like the outcomes being your responsibility. If you tell somebody, hey, if you do this, this will happen, or hey, this worked really well for me, then they might come back and be like, well, I did that and it went terribly and now it's your fault. So anyway, bear that in mind. Give advice cautiously. But being a disciple maker doesn't mean that you just need to be this fount of wisdom in somebody's life, telling them what's best for them. You're not responsible to know everything or to be a really great teacher. If you are a teacher, one of those gifts of Christ given to equip the body, figure out how to use that in that context, how God would have you do that, to be a teacher in that context, to get the most fruit out of it. But do not take away the Bible or the Holy Spirit's role of being the primary teachers in a discipleship context. Right? You could very easily, as a disciple maker, replace the Bible and the Holy Spirit with yourself and make people, by accident, make people come to you for truth and for all kinds of different things, when you should be pointing them to the Word and to the Spirit. And I think a main problem kind of with the knowledge stuff is like what Wade was talking about. Is like, oh, well, when I know enough, then I'll start making disciples because I need to teach them. I need to know all this stuff. But then what's ironic is a lot of times we don't find ourselves taking proactive steps to get that knowledge. We just hope it sometimes happens. And before we know it, we've just been waiting years and years and years for this thing to happen to us where we arrive and we feel comfortable. But you might just find yourself waiting forever. So it's a tough goal to reach if you feel like you need to know enough to start doing disciple making. And the last thing when you're thinking about what's not your responsibility is, it's not your responsibility. You're not responsible for the other people's growth. You're not responsible for the other people's growth. And if people you're discipling aren't growing, I think that's a really great time to ask yourself some questions, to look at your strategy, to be like, is there anything I'm doing that's kind of holding this back? So a good time for reflection, because when you take a guidance role, you want to look for things that are clogging things up. even if it's not your fault. Like, you want to be able to kind of pinpoint those things, like, oh, you're not really putting anything into practice. That's why you're not growing. Like, let's deal with that. Or, hey, are you reading the Bible on your own? But don't take any of those things on yourself, right? It's the person's responsibility to grow as a disciple, to put the word into action, to partner with those elements, and it's the Holy Spirit's role to produce transformation. So things get really weird when we start picking up those responsibilities and carrying them, because there is a line where your life ends and the other person's life starts, and you want to protect that line. Like, don't let it get fuzzy, don't let it get ill-defined. Know where your responsibility ends and where theirs picks up. And if they're not willing to pick up their end of the responsibility, you might not have much work to do in disciple making with that person, and they might need help learning that. I don't mean just drop it. Like, there's some room there for them to grow. So love people, guidance, accountability, prayer. Those are your main responsibilities in disciple making. As a microchurch leader, as a hub leader, as somebody who's making disciples in a personal discipleship capacity, all of those things, those are your main responsibilities.
Well said. Yeah. Teaching does have a place in discipleship, but a lot of times it's just helping people get the missing pieces so that they can own something, right? Like, they're reading their Bible, they're going to their Bible, but they're missing pieces that help them be able to apply that to their own lives or understand what it means. If you can help them with that, great. If you can't, maybe you can ask someone who could, or maybe you could find a resource that that helps them be able to get more out of the Word for themselves. But there's certainly a place for teaching. There's certainly a place for all of that. But the goal is that, I like what Cameron says. It's not just you want to become the answer man. You want self-feeders. You want people who know how to go to God and who can mature and produce their own fruit, right? Not just be totally dependent on you for their growth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. With the teaching thing, I think I could have said it better. It's like, it's not your responsibility to become a teacher in order to become a disciple maker. If you are a teacher, figure out how to use that in disciple making, but don't become something that you're not, or that God's not asking you to be that for somebody else, because will feel very forced, and everybody will probably have a hard time in that situation.
Yeah. I mean, if you think you have to have all the answers, it's just never going to happen, right? So, that's good stuff.